Chicago is known for many things. The first Ferris wheel, invented and built for the 1893 World's Fair. Deep dish pizza, as thick as a book with a delightfully crunchy crust if it's done right. The home of the fictional Gallagher family from the show Shameless. The famous L train, which is kind of like the circulatory system of the city. Chicago is also referred to as the Windy City, which most people think refer to the gusts of wind coming off of Lake Michigan. What most don't know, however, is that Windy City is a phrase that has been used in an accusatory sense by rival cities to refer to its politicians, who have been said to be full of hot air and even called windbags due to their boastful nature. The question is, though, boastful on the behalf of whom? For their citizens or for their own political gain? It's hard to say, because these so-called windy politicians allowed for a huge infiltration of their city. It happened in the still of a very early morning. A team of about 14 plainclothes officers assembled outside an apartment building on the quiet Monroe Street. According to different accounts, the doors kicked in and the shooting begins pretty immediately. In the front living room, Mark Clark, age 22, is on a type of security duty with a shotgun due to the very tense, highly charged political atmosphere. He is shot in the chest by officers and killed instantly. It has been alleged that his shotgun discharged once reflexively. In the rear bedroom, a man is lying next to his pregnant fiancée. Police fire multiple rounds into the bedroom. The man is wounded in the shoulder, and then, after the pregnant fiancée is dragged from the room, a voice could allegedly be heard asking if the man was dead. After a moment of silence, a few shots rang out. Then another voice answered the question. He's good and dead now. During this infiltration, the apartment is subjected to a massive onslaught of gunfire. Officers allegedly fired between 82 and 99 shots. Now, if I didn't know any better, and I read this in an article, I would have thought that this was an ICE raid. Except the date of this raid was December 4th, 1969. This was the murder of the Detroit chapter of the Black Panther Party's leader, Fred Hampton, which was planned out by the FBI's COINTELPRO operation, and then carried out by the Chicago Police Department. Now, extreme racism and political violence certainly aren't new to Chicago, though the circumstances are indeed very different. The president at the time of this incident was Richard Nixon, and though he was no saint, obviously, and approved illegal surveillance and many other operations on top of his corruption and the Watergate scandal, he didn't directly put this assassination into motion. In contrast, it was Trump directly who has ordered the ICE raids, which have resulted in desperation, devastation, and death. It seems as though Donald Trump's presidency has revived something Americans thought that they'd long since buried within the casket of J. Edgar Hoover: the weaponization of federal power against political opposition. As a candidate, Trump promised revenge with his grievance politics. As president, he's delivering pretty much exactly what he promised. At the Department of Justice, a so-called weaponization working group now keeps a running list of Trump's political enemies, which includes, but is not limited to, journalists, former officials, critics, all ready to go for investigation. Within months, Trump's new Justice Department stacked sky high with loyalists, indicted former FBI Director James Comey one of Trump's most vocal adversaries. He even seems to be punishing Comey's daughter, who is known as one of the prosecutors on the case against Diddy, by having the DOJ fire her. The indictment of James Comey came at Trump's public urging, despite warnings from career prosecutors that there is no legal basis. Inside the FBI, Director Kash Patel, another Trump loyalist, / former Defense Department Chief of Staff / far-right podcaster, has gutted the Bureau, firing top officials and a large number of agents who had once investigated Trump or the January 6th insurrectionists. The purge recalls the darkest era of Hoover's 48-year reign, when the FBI became a personal instrument of political control over the nation. As we have already touched on, we know that Hoover's COINTELPRO operations targeted civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and basically anyone challenging the state's narrative, surveilling, discrediting, and in cases like Fred Hampton's, enabling their deaths. Trump's new order doesn't rely on secret files and wiretaps. It's driven by indictments and purges and a steady erosion of America's institutions. Both men have wielded federal law enforcement as weapons of intimidation and worse. When Trump publicly demanded the firing of a U.S. attorney who refused to prosecute his rivals, the attorney resigned. When top aide Stephen Miller vowed to hunt leftist domestic terrorists, without evidence, mind you, the administration made clear that dissent itself is indeed the enemy. In Hoover's time, the FBI acted like a secret police force. Under Trump and Patel, it is becoming an open one, loyal not to the Constitution as is its supposed duty, but to a single man's grievances and psychopathy. The rhyming of history is unmistakable. Hoover framed his operations as national security. Trump kind of says the quiet part through a megaphone, referring to what he is doing as retribution and patriotism. And while we're discussing a different century in this episode, it's still the same playbook. Because, as we've learned through this series, political witch hunts, and make no mistake about it, witch hunts are always political. Well, unfortunately, they never seem to go out of style. I'm Nicole Davenport, and this is Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. Content warning, political violence and racism, and a brief mention of suicide. Use caution when listening. To my American listeners, I wish to acknowledge the extreme stress and fear that must be becoming a significant part of life for many of you. I wanted to encourage those of you who are able to help provide food or voluntary work through your communities. There's also an organization called Feeding America, which strives for an America where no one goes hungry. They state that hunger is a big challenge, but together we can solve it. They approach ending food insecurity from every angle, and they're also accepting donations. A link can be found in the show notes. That being said, let's get started. Now, when you all think of the Black Panther Party, what comes to mind? I bet you didn't know that their original name was Black Panther Party of Self-Defense. I didn't know. I also realized that in school, we were taught that the Black Panther Party was a malicious, militant group, which makes sense because the folks writing those history books were likely the same people influenced by Hoover's propaganda. And thanks to that propaganda, many Americans, especially those relying on mainstream news or FBI statements, associated the Panthers with violence and guns and shootouts, black leather jackets, and weapons, mainly assault rifles. Hoover even went so far as to label them as, quote, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country, framing them as a hate group comparable to that of the likes of the KKK, but inverted. I wonder if this is where we got that term reverse racism from. Headlines often highlighted armed patrols, confrontations with police, and later, high-profile cases like the 1969 Chicago raid that killed Fred Hampton, which was, of course, framed as a national security issue. All of this only reinforced the completely false assumptions that the party's core was criminal or terroristic. What the Black Panther Party actually set out to do was quite different from the rhetoric that was pushed by Hoover and his FBI. You see, it all started around World War II, during the early part of the Second Great Migration. Now, the Second Great Migration, for those unfamiliar, was the migration of more than 5 million African Americans out of the South and into the North, the Northeast, the West, and the Northwest from the 1940s until around the 1970s or so. So when this second migration began, it was basically to escape all of the places that the Jim Crow laws applied. This event also came about as a result of the search for employment within the war industry. That being said, it isn't like these other places were magical utopias of equality or anything like that. And one can say this is partially implied by the so-called white flight or white exodus, which was the large-scale migration of white people from the industrialized urban areas of the cities into the suburbs as a result of racial integration and desegregation. Groups of young people of color began to endure new forms of racism, segregation, repression, and hence poverty within the urban areas of the not South. And wouldn't you know it, with the white flight came the flight of employers, also into suburban areas, leaving people of color in terrible conditions, which would be labeled urban ghettos, and included substandard housing, zero employment opportunities, no political representation at all, and no possibility for higher education. The eventual civil rights movement, which used nonviolent civil disobedience, seemed unable to improve any of these conditions. And so, eventually, the Black Panther Party of Defense was formed in an attempt to develop forms of politics to battle these grossly unfair conditions and treatment. Founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the party's original activity consisted of legally monitoring police with law books and then legal firearms to deter brutality that was occurring heavily in communities of color. Their published platform demanded things like full-time employment, decent housing, education that told the truth about Black history, an end to police brutality, and jury trials by peers, essentially civil and economic rights. To make their demands clear, they created a manifesto, the Panthers' declaration of what they wanted and what they believed, which included 10 points. They are listed as followed. Number 1, we want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our Black community. 2, we want full employment for our people. 3, we want an end to the robbery by the capitalists of our Black and oppressed communities. 4, We want decent housing, fit for the shelter of human beings. 5. We want education that exposes the true nature of this society and teaches our real history. 6. We want all black men and women exempt from military service. 7. We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. 8. We want freedom for all black people held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. 9. We want all black people, when brought to trial, to be tried by a jury of their peers from their own communities. 10. We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. These were the beliefs and moral code that the Black Panther Party taught and lived by. A plan for survival and for dignity, really. And alongside it, the Panthers taught the rules. How to behave when stopped, searched, or interrogated by police, which basically went like this. Stay calm. Don't resist. Demand your rights. Don't speak without a lawyer. Record badge numbers. Protect each other. Self-defense went hand in hand with discipline, much more so than how to handle weapons. And every member was to know exactly what their rights were as American citizens. Then came the Mulford Act. The Mulford Act was a California law passed in 1967 that made it illegal to openly carry loaded firearms in public without a permit. It was written by Republican Assemblyman Don Mulford and signed into law by none other than then-Governor Ronald Reagan. The law was created largely in response to the activities of the Black Panther Party, who had been patrolling their communities while armed to monitor police behavior, an early form of what's now called cop watching. Keep in mind that there was nothing wrong with what they were doing. American citizens in the state of California, before the Mulford Act, of course, had the right to carry loaded firearms. And when the Panthers protested the bill by marching with guns into the California state capitol on May 2nd, 1967, the bill was declared an urgency statute, allowing lawmakers to fast-track it through the legislature. Newspapers such as the New York Times and the Sacramento Bee published salacious headlines that went a little something like, quote, "A band of young Negroes armed with loaded rifles, pistols, and shotguns entered the Capitol Tuesday." Yeah. The act passed with broad bipartisan support from both Republicans and Democrats, as well as from the National Rifle Association, you got it folks, the NRA, and was signed into law on July 28th, 1967. Yeah, the NRA, Kind of unbelievable. Governor Reagan defended the law, saying there was no reason for citizens to carry loaded weapons in public and that the bill wouldn't harm law-abiding citizens. It's not like he's wrong there, but he did it for all the wrong reasons, to further suppress a group of people. Now we're going to fast forward a bit to January 1969 in West Oakland. Inside St. Augustine's Episcopal Church, the smell of pancakes and grits fills the air. It's barely dawn. Volunteers, mostly women of color, are setting plates for neighborhood kids. This is the start of the legendary Free Breakfast for Children program, and it was the very first program of its kind in American history. For real. Look it up. The government tried a pilot school breakfast program, but it wasn't until 1975 that it became a real thing. One of the BPP's main ideas that had been around since the beginning of its formation was that they cannot expect their oppressors to help them They have to do it themselves, through community. By spring that same year, chapters from Chicago to Los Angeles were running the breakfast program out of church basements, community centers, and storefronts, serving tens of thousands of meals before school every single week. But while the kids ate, sometimes police officers would come to show their presence, creating a tense, scary atmosphere for those kids, sometimes even standing over them. Armed police, often directed by local Red Squads and the FBI's COINTELPRO operations, would barge into these programs, rifles drawn under the pretext of looking for illegal activities. They'd photograph the volunteers, threaten arrests, and walk circles around the children with guns pointed down, all to brand the scene as dangerous, as communist, as other. I mean, imagine being like 6 years old, eating oatmeal, preparing for the school day, under the barrel of a fucking shotgun. This was America's idea of public safety. But still, the Panthers kept cooking. Have you guys ever heard of the term snitch-jacketing? Snitch-jacketing, sometimes called bad-jacketing, is the deliberate act of making someone inside a movement look like a government informant or traitor when they aren't. The overall goal of this technique is to create and sow mistrust, isolate the target or targets, and break down the group's cohesion. Tactics included planting forged letters, spreading rumors, or staging incidents that make a person appear to be cooperating with police or with the FBI. And this was the FBI's favorite way to attempt to poison a movement during COINTELPRO operations. The idea was simple. Make a loyal comrade look like a traitor, spread rumors, forge letters, plant fake informant reports, feed the gossip mill until everyone's looking over their shoulder, suspecting the other of being a snitch or even an undercover agent. The execution was brutal in its simplicity and pretty damn juvenile, but in the most deadly way. Agents would mail anonymous letters to Panther headquarters saying things like, "Your comrade is talking to the cops," or "So-and-so is sleeping with your wife." And for Hoover, being the weirdo little creep he was, the more salacious, the better. His crew of FBI lackeys would forge official-looking FBI memos and accidentally leak them to local police or journalists. They even used paid informants to spread vicious rumors during meetings or to slide forged documents under office doors. In Oakland, one internal memo boasted that the goal was to, quote, create the impression that several top leaders are cooperating with the Bureau, end quote. The FBI's goal was to make them hate each other and hopefully even murder each other. Relationships and friendships were obliterated, and some of those rumors actually did end in real bloodshed. Not by the government's hand directly, which was by design, of course, but by the mistrust it cultivated within the BPP. Take Elmer Geronimo Pratt, for example, a decorated Vietnam veteran and respected Panther. The FBI spent years trying to frame him as an informant. They used actual infiltrators to accuse him of betrayal while planting evidence in a murder case against him. Pratt served 27 years in prison due to that planted evidence before being exonerated. It took until 1997 for a judge to admit that the state had withheld evidence showing a key witness, Julius Butler, was, in fact, an FBI informant. Then there's Richard Aoki, one of the few Asian American members of the party. He armed early Panther patrols, literally handed them weapons, and decades later, after his death, evidence surfaced that he'd been an FBI informant from the very beginning. The FBI knew exactly who was armed with what in Aoki's area. This adds such a complex and dark layer to the Panther's early years, because even their inner circle was never truly safe. And as stated before, the dirtier and more salacious, the better for Hoover and his goons. They 100% used sex as a weapon. Hoover's agents spread rumors that leaders were sleeping with members' wives or girlfriends, or, quote, using Panther girls for pleasure, end quote. It was meant to destroy trust and humiliate women in the movement. I mean, think about it. Hoover, a man so seemingly terrified of his own sexuality, as stated a couple episodes ago, and who was also highly suspected of having a romantic relationship with Clyde Tolson, his second in command, that he built an entire career policing people he saw as subversive? This had to be due to his own self-loathing, or just using that old "look over there" trick so that no one was looking at what he was doing. Anyway, I digress. These operations made every comrade a suspect. Members stopped attending meetings, chapters split into factions. The paranoia was so thick in the air you could cut it with a knife. People started searching each other's houses for bugs, accusing friends of being plants or informants, and sometimes, tragically, attacking one another. The Panthers were young. Most were in their 20s. They were bright and they were bold, but they were also just human. And Hoover knew that if he could make them doubt each other, he wouldn't need to shoot them at all. He hoped that they'd do that part on their own. I mean, it's kind of giving Charles Manson. Anyway, then came the Chicago chapter. Fred Hampton was just a kid from the Chicago suburbs. He was quiet, intelligent, and athletic. He was born on August 30th, 1948, in Summit, Illinois, to Francis and Ibera Hampton. His father worked at the Argo Starch Company, and his mother was a domestic worker who had been active in the NAACP. By high school, Fred was already showing leadership skills. He was class president for 3 straight years at Proviso East High in Maywood. Teachers described him as focused and articulate. He also seemed to be great at organizing. He started student protests demanding more Black teachers, more inclusive textbooks, and better lunch conditions. He was 16, leading demonstrations against racism before most kids his age were even aware of the problem. After graduation, he studied pre-law at Triton Junior College, planning to use the law to defend his community. Around the same time, the civil rights movement was shifting. After the assassinations of Malcolm X in 1965 and MLK Jr. in 1968, younger activists were losing faith in the nonviolence approach. In early 1968, Fred joined the NAACP Youth Council and soon became its chairman. Under him, membership jumped to more than 500 young people in the Chicago area. He organized a campaign for recreational facilities and educational resources in Black neighborhoods. Those early successes caught the attention of the Black Panther Party, newly expanding from Oakland to other cities. In May of 1968, Fred Hampton, then just 20 years old, was accused of stealing $71 worth of ice cream bars from a Good Humor truck in Maywood, Illinois. Prosecutors alleged that Hampton and several others ordered the driver to distribute the ice cream to neighborhood children without paying. Hampton was charged with robbery and sentenced to 2 to 5 years in prison. Can you believe that? Hampton and supporters maintained that the accusation was false and politically motivated. His attorneys argued that the case lacked credible evidence and that the charge was part of a broader pattern of surveillance and criminalization of Black activists during the late 1960s. Many historians now consider the robbery case to have been exaggerated or even fabricated by law enforcement to discredit Hampton's growing influence. While Hampton did serve some time in Cook County Jail for the conviction, his sentence was eventually reduced, and he was released on appeal. In late 1968, Fred Hampton founded the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. His charisma and hardcore determination made him one of the fastest rising leaders in the movement. He was known for speaking in plain language instead of in an uppity academic way that can make people feel kind of dumb. He could talk about Marxism, capitalism, and class struggle in a way that resonated with working class people. Crowds loved him because he was real. He said things like, quote, "We're not going to fight racism with racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity." Isn't that powerful? And that right there sums up why he scared the establishment. He was loudly challenging the status quo. Hampton was building what he referred to as a rainbow coalition, an anti-racist, anti-classist organization which featured a broad alliance between the Panthers, the Young Lords, who were a Puerto Rican group, and the Young Patriots, who were poor white activists from the South Side. It's pretty clear he understood that poverty, police brutality, and housing inequality cut across race. To J. Edgar Hoover, that kind of unity was absolute nightmare fuel. The FBI had already labeled the Black Panther Party, quote, "the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States," as I believe I mentioned in the beginning. Hampton's ability to bridge divides made him, personally, one of the Bureau's top domestic targets. So the FBI hatched a plan. You see, to get to Hampton, the FBI turned to William O'Neill, a 17-year-old car thief busted for impersonating a federal officer. Faced with some pretty serious charges, he was given a choice: prison or cooperation. O'Neill agreed to infiltrate the Panthers. He joined Hampton's Chicago chapter and quickly gained his trust. So much that Hampton eventually appointed him to head of security. This meant O'Neill knew where meetings were held, where weapons were stashed, and where Fred slept at night. And through his FBI handler, Agent Roy Mitchell, O'Neill regularly provided inside information, floor plans, schedules, and internal conflicts, the kind of intelligence COINTELPRO absolutely thrived on. By late 1969, as police raids on Panther offices increased nationwide, the Bureau was mapping out what it called, quote, "a preventative operation." On the night of December 3rd, Hampton had been speaking at a local college. He came home feeling exhausted. O'Neill, who was present that evening, brought him dinner. It has been reported that the food was heavily laced with a powerful barbiturate. And straight away, I just want to say that Fred Hampton did not do drugs. Everybody in his life can attest to this. There was no history of drug use. Hampton fell asleep mid-conversation that evening while he was on the phone with his mom. His pregnant fiancée, Deborah Johnson, lay next to him in bed. A few hours later, around 4:45 a.m., the apartment door exploded in. 14 members of the Chicago Police Department's tactical unit, backed by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, and informed by the FBI, of course, burst in with a search warrant for illegal weapons. They fired almost as soon as they got in there. Mark Clark, a Panther guarding the front door, was hit first, shot right through the heart. His shotgun discharged once as his body fell and hit the floor. And this was the only shot fired by the Panthers that early morning. The officers moved room to room, firing more than 90 rounds. Deborah Johnson, lying beside Fred, tried to shake him awake, but he wouldn't move. The drugs, they just kept him from being able to even wake up. It was then that they dragged her from the room and into the hallway. She heard voices coming from the room that she was dragged out of say, "He's barely alive. But he'll make it." And then a weapon was fired a few times, and then one of the voices stated, "He's good and dead now." Fred Hampton, age 21, was killed in his bed. The so-called official story claimed that there had been a fierce gunfight, but ballistics proved otherwise. Of nearly 100 bullets fired, only that one came from the Panthers. Mark Clark's reflex shot as he died. An investigation later confirmed that the FBI had provided the floor plan of the apartment, which had been drawn by William O'Neill himself. The plan marked an X where Hampton slept. An X, like some pirate map. A civil suit in the 1970s revealed that both the FBI and the Chicago police had cooperated in the raid. Families of the victims were eventually awarded a $1.85 million settlement in 1982, but it's not like it was an admission of guilt. I guess at least it was acknowledgement of misconduct. Deborah Johnson, who later changed her name to Akua Nyeri, survived. Akua and Fred's son, Fred Hampton Jr., was born just a few weeks after all this happened, and he continues his father's activism today. As for William O'Neill, well, he kept working for the FBI for years, collecting payments totaling over $10,000. In 1990, he was interviewed for a documentary, a second part of a documentary called Eyes on the Prize. Just hours afterward, he took his own life by running into traffic on a Chicago expressway. Now, when we take a step back and really look at the FBI's extreme targeting of the Black Panther Party, I think it's important to ask, why did it bother them so much? Why did the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover personally pour more time and energy and money and manpower into crushing the Black Panther Party than almost any other target in COINTELPRO operations? I think it was because here was a generation of young people of color who refused to wait for permission from the establishment, from their oppressors, to live a fulfilling, meaningful life. They refused to ask for help. They were feeding kids before school. They were running free medical clinics. They were defending neighborhoods from police brutality. By 1971, they were opening free medical clinics in cities across the country, referred to as People's Free Health Centers. One of their boldest acts was launching nationwide sickle-cell testing and education campaigns. At that time, the federal government barely acknowledged the disease, probably because it disproportionately affected African Americans and not white people. The Panthers had to take matters into their own hands. They screened nearly 500,000 people, which forced Washington to act. Hell, the BPP was making DC look bad on so many different occasions. Within a year, federal funding for sickle cell research jumped dramatically. The Black Panther Party also offered free clothing and legal aid, senior citizen escort programs, bus rides to visit relatives in prison, and even community schools. They labeled these survival programs. As mentioned before, they also built alliances under the Rainbow Coalition with groups such as the Puerto Rican activists known as the Young Lords, Students for a Democratic Society, and even some poor white Appalachian groups, framing their struggle as anti-racist and anti-capitalist rather than anti-white. They were trying to obtain exactly what the United States of America claims to celebrate: independence, self-determination, community participation. But because they were people of color, it was all seen as a threat. Hoover labeled them terrorists. But I mean, who was really terrorizing whom? Let's do a quick review here, shall we? Armed police stormed breakfast programs where children were eating. Check. Constant police violence against the party. Check. The FBI planted spies, forged letters, spread rumors, and handed over floor plans for midnight raids, which resulted in murder. This is what they referred to as counterintelligence. They weren't countering anything. They were aggressors, violent aggressors. The truth is, the Panthers weren't dangerous, but all that propaganda insinuating that they were, thanks to Hoover and COINTELPRO, that was dangerous, and that got many Panthers killed. When you read through the COINTELPRO files, you see how personal Hoover made all of it. I mean, he went after people feeding children way harder than he went after those that were burning crosses. And even now, decades later, echoes of that same logic and that same ideology are playing out in front of our eyes within the Trump administration. Black history is being erased from school curriculums. Entire states are rewriting textbooks and using clown organizations like PragerU. If you don't know who PragerU is, look them up. And they are not a university. They're turning the history of oppression into challenges and slavery into unpaid labor, whitewashing so much history of people of color. And that's why we have to talk about this history loudly and without apology, because erasure is its own kind of violence. The question that lingers after all of this is, why is a community's self-sufficiency still treated like defiance? Why does Black empowerment still get framed as a threat to whiteness? And the answer, to me, in my opinion, lies in patriarchy. Control of the other. Because once people realize they can feed, educate, and protect one another without the system's approval, such as the astounding work of the Black Panther Party, the system starts to look kind of unnecessary, and the patriarchy can't have any of that. That's why the story of the Black Panther Party still matters. Because I think every time someone organizes a mutual aid group or opens a free clinic or even starts a community breakfast program, there's a spirit that ignites there. No matter how many times they try to erase it, it keeps coming back. Because they can kill a revolutionary, but they can never kill the revolution. During the COINTELPRO operation, the FBI documented using snitch-jacketing type of tactics against many groups, not just the Black Panther Party, but also the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and the New Left, also feminists and the American Indian movement, just to name a few. And that's where we're going to pick up next time. As I said last time, I'm just trying to get one section done at a time here. And if that means going through many episodes, then that's what I got to do to tell these stories. After we close up the COINTELPRO operations on the next episode, the episode after that will close up the entire witch hunt series with the crack baby myth and the welfare queen myth, which I think, especially the latter one, is pretty relevant to what's happening today with the SNAP benefits. That's all I got for today. But remember, stay vigilant, stay vocal, because silence is complicity. See you guys next time.